This is a drawing of a mid-sagittal plane through the brain. Mid-sagittal plane through the brain shows you most of the anatomy. So this is more of a review. I'm not going to go over this drawing right now because I think you can pause and go over all these structures on your own. But it shows most of what we've talked about: the brain stem and the three regions, the diencephalon and its three regions, the cerebellum, the cerebrum. It shows the pituitary gland as well. So I'm going to leave this drawing for you to study on your own time. The next topic is cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is a water-like fluid, so it looks a lot like water, but it has a lot of important ingredients, if you will, in it. And this fluid acts much like blood might in that it distributes a lot of nutrients throughout the brain and spinal cord. It helps maintain electrolyte levels throughout the brain and spinal cord. We can use it as a diagnostic tool by taking it from the subarachnoid space at the bottom of the spinal cord and look for infection, look for electrolyte imbalance. So cerebrospinal fluid has a lot of importance in protecting the brain and spinal cord, but also in diagnostics as far as brain problems, imbalances, infection. What this drawing is showing is what we call the brain ventricles. The brain ventricles are cavities within the brain. They're shown here in kind of a blue and green color because inside these cavities is cerebrospinal fluid, this watery liquid. The ventricles are divided into four. Each hemisphere has two large arced-shaped lateral ventricles. So there's a right lateral ventricle and a left lateral ventricle in the two hemispheres. Those two lateral ventricles then connect to a centrally located ventricle called the third ventricle. That's found within the diencephalon. So this is a cavity within the diencephalon. Then there's a little tube that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. That tube is known as the aqueduct, either the aqueduct of the midbrain, because it goes right down the midbrain, or the cerebral aqueduct. The fourth ventricle is situated between the cerebellum and the brainstem, and then from the fourth ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid can go down the central canal, but also gain access to the subarachnoid space, which, if you recall, that is the space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So now you can get cerebrospinal fluids surrounding the brain and the subarachnoid space, but also surrounding the spinal cord. So this just tells us where we would find cerebrospinal fluid: in the brain ventricles, in the subarachnoid space, and in the central canal. This is another view to help understand how large some of these ventricles are. This is a transverse section through a human brain showing these large cavities. These are the two lateral ventricles. I want to make a note of this tissue located inside the ventricle. This tissue hanging inside of the ventricle is known as a choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is the tissue that produces cerebrospinal fluid. That tissue is made up of ependymal cells and blood capillaries. So recall that ependymal cells are neuroglial cells of the CNS that produce cerebrospinal fluid from blood. So they take this blood, which is rich in electrolytes, rich in nutrients, extracts the fluid from it, so the blood plasma, and that becomes cerebrospinal fluid. And that cerebrospinal fluid then fills the ventricles, and it starts to circulate. Also notice that these ependymal cells have little cilia. These little cilia help push that cerebrospinal fluid and allow it to flow through the ventricles. This is, in essence, the home run for cerebrospinal fluid. It tells you everything you need to know as far as where it comes from, where it's found, how does it circulate, and even how does it get returned back to the bloodstream. So what I'd like to do is start with this schematic here on the left. And cerebrospinal fluid all starts as arterial blood. That's the blood going up to your brain. Okay, it's got oxygen, it's got electrolytes, it's got a lot of good stuff in it, if you will. Well, that enters the capillaries of the choroid plexes. Choroid plexes are found in all your ventricles. Those choroid plexes contain ependymal cells that take the blood plasma, the liquid part of your blood, and turn it into cerebrospinal fluid. Notice cerebrospinal fluid on these figures is shown in purple. So wherever you see purple arrows, that's cerebrospinal fluid. So where do you have cerebrospinal fluid? Lateral ventricles, third ventricle, through the aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, through some little holes called apertures to get into the subarachnoid space, and then finally, you have to return it back to the bloodstream because it circulates. You make new cerebrospinal fluid, and you have to get rid of the quote-unquote old cerebrospinal fluid. That's done using a tissue called the arachnoid villi because it's part of the arachnoid mater. That tissue takes that cerebrospinal fluid and puts it into a different kind of blood vessel called the venous sinuses. Venous sinuses act a lot like veins in that the blood in these venous sinuses is leaving the brain. It's getting removed from the brain and sent back down to your heart. So we call that blood venous blood, pertaining to veins. So using this scheme here, we can find where this all happens. So here, these arrows, here is the lateral ventricle and its choroid plexus. Here's the third ventricle and its choroid plexus. There's the fourth ventricle and its choroid plexus. So you'll notice that's where the purple arrows begin, because that's where it's being made. Then it moves. We can follow some of these arrows and watch it go down the aqueduct to the fourth. We can see it go down the central canal. Right here, you notice how it gets out of that ventricle into the subarachnoid space. So now we've got it. We've got it surrounding both the spinal cord and surrounding the brain. So another function of that cerebrospinal fluid is to cushion the brain and spinal cord. So your CNS is in essence floating within a thin layer of cerebrospinal fluid. And note that if we want to extract it, we go down below the spinal cord and remove cerebrospinal fluid. So lumbar punctures or spinal taps are usually done either between L3 and L4 vertebrae or L4 and L5 vertebrae. So once it circulates, we got to get it back. We got to remove it now. And there's one area right here I want you to focus on. Right there, you'll notice that purple arrow is going from the subarachnoid space into this blue stuff. This blue stuff represents venous blood. It's found in a sinus known as the superior sagittal sinus. A sinus is similar to a blood vessel. So that's how we get that cerebrospinal fluid back into the blood while we're still making new. So we keep making new, getting rid of old. And that's the complete circuit that cerebrospinal fluid takes. This figure I'd like you to read through on your own. What it does is it puts some of the functional differences into either a job of the right hemisphere or a job of the left hemisphere. So notice, first thing is they control opposite sides of the body. So the right hemisphere receives sensory information from and controls muscles on the left side. So they work contralaterally. Then you've got all these traits that the right side typically is involved with. Musical, artistic, space and patterns, facial expression, emotion is largely right, and you can read through the left being more reasoning, numerical, and scientific skills, and then language. A lot of language is left hemisphere. But take your time, read through this table on your own. Finally, I'd like to talk about two brain systems. Brain systems are many parts of the brain working together. One is known as the reticular formation. Reticular formation is involved in maintaining consciousness and alertness. There's a number of parts of the brain stem that are involved in this. So your brain stem is at the top of the list as far as keeping you aware, keeping you conscious and alert, because it has vasomotor, cardiac, and respiratory centers. Then there's a system known as the limbic system. We often call it our emotional brain or affective brain. Many parts of the brain, largely diencephalon and cerebrum, that are involved in emotions. So anger, fear, so it helps us recognize those as being emotional facial expressions. It assesses danger, which can be very emotional, elicits fear responses. So all things emotion related is known as the limbic system. It can help express emotions, resolves mental conflict. And then there are some other senses that affect the limbic system, like your sense of smell. Your sense of smell is linked to your limbic system. Certain smells make us emotional. They make us happy. They might even make us sad. And then there's also a link between the limbic system and memory. If you think about one of your earliest memories of your life, there was probably some sort of emotional impact. Whether it was a bad emotion. Some people's first memories are, breaking a bone, or unfortunately abuse usually sticks in someone's brain as one of the, an early memory, or maybe a very exciting event. Maybe you went to Disneyland and that was, you still remember going in and meeting Mickey Mouse. But the point is that emotions often help establish memories. And then finally, there's a link between the limbic system and pain. Pain tends to be very, very emotional. And usually it's not the acute pain. If you cut your finger, yes, you get some emotions there. But I'm talking about more of the chronic pain some people experience. Some people with chronic back pain ultimately end up being depressed and very anxious about it. That chronic pain really affects the limbic system. And chronic pain makes people very, very depressed, anxious, distressed. So a lot of times, chronic pain is treated with antidepressants because of that link between chronic pain and the limbic system. Okay, next section is pictures of the brain, but that's going to be when we dissect brains. So you're going to see that I'm going to skip over all these pictures of the sheep brain and go into the cranial nerve section.